Now. Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. Today I have a very special treat. I'm joined by my fellow Pro Shroud expert, Otangelo Grasso, or amateur expert, whatever you want to call me. But welcome back to the show, Otangelo. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Dale. How about you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Although I had to do a lot of work because, as Otangelo knows, the reason for this show is we actually had a couple of Shroud skeptics who are new to the Shroud. They admit that they're new to the Shroud and stuff like that. But they did a 10-hour video debunking the Shroud. 10 hours. My gosh, I thought my Shroud Wars shows were long when they're at the 4 hour mark, but somehow they did 10 hours. So I had to watch over that. And that's why me and Atangela are here to kind of give our take on, what did these Shroud skeptics come up with? Did they come up with good debunkings for the Shroud of Turin or not? But yeah, Atangela, just before we get into today's topic, I just want to give it over to you to kind of introduce the audience again as to who you are, to remind them about your background and yeah, what's your background with the Shroud in particular, since that's the topic.
Well, first of all, I don't think they have debunked the shroud. They tried, so they gave their view. But as we will see here in the stream, I don't think they have gone deep enough into the science to really being able to provide a consistent and powerful refutation. But about me, I am Swiss Italian, for who doesn't know me. I have over the years debated many atheists, and about 2 years ago or so, I've seen so many streams on YouTube of atheists trying to refute even the historicity of Jesus. And I said, well, let me make some in-depth investigation. And that gave rise to a two-volume book, which is called um, Confirming Joshua. And there I dedicated about 200 pages on the Shroud of Turin. And I think this was one of the most powerful evidence for not only for the historicity actually of the Shroud, but also of the portrayal of Jesus in the Gospels, the crucifixion and the resurrection. So following that, I did further investigation. That did give rise to a second book, which has over 500 pages on the Shroud of Turin. So anyone that is interested can search for my name on Amazon, and will find my books. And yeah, so that's basically how I came into investigating the Shroud. And I think it has been very, very powerful to deepen my understanding of the Passion. And basically, I call the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo the empirical link which corroborates the truthfulness and historicity of the Gospel accounts.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, well, great to have you. Welcome to the Shroud Wars. I know you were on the show before, but this is the first time having you on related to the Shroud of Turin. So, yeah. All right. Well, I think the first place to get started then is just kind of giving our general take. So I know in your case you didn't watch the full video, but you definitely were there for certain bits and pieces of it. I'm just kind of curious, just in general, like what was your overall takeaway in terms of how the skeptics did here?
Well, I think dedicating 9 hours to investigate the shroud is commendable. I think in that sense, not many have dedicated that much time. And most people that I meet, they just say, well, it has carbon radio. They been dated in 1988, and it's bunk, basically, without going deeper into it. But I think Nathan and James, they have at least said, well, let's give a closer look into it, which is commendable. Now, in regards of how they approached the matter, that is what I have some disagreement, because I think they first of all, I think if you come in already from the start with the presupposition or the prejudice that the shroud is not authentic, then you will investigate and dedicate all your efforts to try to confirm what you already want to be true. And at the end of the stream, I called Nathan out of this, and he tried to defend himself and say, no, I would love the shroud to be true, but I think it isn't. And I really don't buy that, because I think there are many shroud researchers today which have gone through the same process, which have really um, dedicated time to investigate all the evidence. And many like Joe Marino, Tristan Casabianca, Bob Rucker, and many others, they came actually to believe that the shroud is genuine and authentic, and in base of that, that Christ is who he said to be, based on the evidence on the shroud. So I think anyone really looking into it cannot come to another conclusion than that it is authentic. So that's why I actually don't buy it that they are genuine and honestly looking into it to find out the truth. But because if they would, after 9 hours dedicating to researching it, I think it would be already quite enough to come to the conclusion that the image formation and all other evidence that we see on the shroud is a test is evidence enough that the shroud is genuine, that it is the burial cloth of Jesus.
So that's interesting. Just a quick follow-up before I get into my own kind of general thoughts. So do you think that the evidence from the Shroud of Turin is so powerful that it's proven beyond all reasonable doubt, so that uh, anyone who's a skeptic, like they're not even a reasonable person. They may have doubts, but it's not reasonable doubt. Would you go that far, or do you think it's just like, because I know Gary Habermas, for example, he oscillates between 70 to like 85% in terms of his belief in the shroud. But when I think like proven beyond reasonable doubt, I'm thinking like 95% plus proven. So where do you stand there, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, I made a calculation where I did put all relevant factors on the table, and to each of those I gave um, a chance parameter. What would be the chance that this would be the way we see it on the shroud, and then different issues, and then I did sum it up, and then calculated what the odds would be that the shroud is a forgery. And I think that having lined up all the evidence, I came up with the number. Of course, these numbers, they are not, I mean, there is a range of possibilities up and down, but using a reasonable range, I came up with a sum of 1 in 10 to the 23rd power.
Oh, wow.
So, so in my understanding, it's not 80 or 90%, but 99.9999, and put many
Nice.
numbers forth that it is genuine. So I have no doubts.
Gotcha. Gotcha. All right, cool. So yeah, just kind of turning it over to me, my general thoughts. And I have watched the whole thing not once but twice. So I did my prep, I did my work for this show. And I kind of concur with you, Otangelo. In the first place, look, I always want to encourage Shroud skeptics when people are doing videos on the Shroud. I think that's great, because for so many years it was often just neglected and dismissed. So in the first place, yeah, I want to congratulate these Shroud skeptics for doing 10 hours almost. I couldn't do that in one sitting, right? So, and it was clear from the fact that they did their research, right? So again, they admit they only did a couple days worth of research. So of course, as Otangelo said, I agree with him. There's a lot that I disagree in there. There are a lot of areas of ignorance that I saw. There were certain double standards. I didn't like how they treated certain people. This was one of the things Bob Rucker told me behind the scenes. He didn't like how they referred to Gary Habermas, and they really went after Giulio Fonte, and these guys are friends. And I thought that was very their assessments there were unfair. But looking on the positive side, I mean, look, for a couple days worth of research, I felt these guys did an amazing job getting familiar with the different pieces of evidences and how they fit together and making their assessment and trying to approach it in a systematic way. So I give a thumbs up for that. I think it's always a great start. But my hope is, don't end there. There's still more to learn. You guys got some things wrong and stuff like that. So I'm glad to see that they're open to learning more. And hopefully Otangelo and I will do a good job in pointing out some of the problematic areas in the show and some of the things we agree or disagree with. So yeah, I think in terms of categories of topics, so that there was one thing, just as kind of a general intro that I wanted to show because they mentioned one of the things they mentioned, Otangelo, right in the beginning was that, well, look, the Shroud, Shroudies say that the Shroud is totally unique. There's nothing else like it. And they kind of said, well, no, there are tons of shrouds. They listed about 4 or 5 different shrouds, one of which was the Shroud of Bisankon. And I just wanted to kind of share my screen because the Shroud of Bisankon is totally nothing like the Shroud of Turin. All the other copies of the Shroud, they don't compare at all. So let me just kind of show a quick. Okay, so entire screen, share sound. So is that popping up there?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, so in the first place, here's the Shroud of Bisankon, right? And here's the Shroud of Turin. The realism is just nothing like this later created image. And look at the bloodstains. They're little round circles based on these things from the Shroud of Bisankon, which is said to be similar. And so I just think that there is no comparison. The Shroud is truly unique in terms of its realism. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. I'm going to quote not a Christian, but an agnostic medieval art historian, Dr. Thomas de Westlow, talking about this. So I've got a clip of him, 6:30 to 10:42. So let me just play this 4-minute clip. Okay.
There are 3 simple changes I tell all of my arthritis patients to make. Number 1, you have to start drinking more water. This. You wouldn't believe how dehydrated most people are.
Now, if the Shroud is a medieval image dating from around this period, art historians like me ought to be able to look at it and study it and tell you who painted it, how they painted it, where it was painted, and so on. But we can't. And the reason is that it's not like any medieval image. Here's one obvious problem. The image you see on the left is the image on the Shroud. This is the cloth image, just showing the facial area. Now, it's a very sort of mysterious mask, but it contains an extraordinary secret. Because when you photograph it, and this was done for the first time at the end of the 19th century, you discover that tonally reversed, that odd mask, which is all people would have seen in the Middle Ages, it contains this extraordinary, astonishingly realistic, positive image. It's amazingly realistic, like a photo. Now, this would have been completely beyond anyone painting in the 14th century. I show you on the right, this wonderful painting by Simone Martini. It's an artist I've studied. And it shows you how people were painting the face of Christ in the 14th century. Now, it's very obviously stylized. You can see the brush strokes, you can see the outlines. Unlike the Shroud image, which is basically just like a modern photo. Now, here's a second reason why that image on the Shroud can't be a medieval image. No one in the Middle Ages knew about negative images. No one knew about negative images until the discovery of photography in the 19th century. And no one in the Middle Ages would have wasted their time, even if they could have done, producing an image like you see on the left that you could only appreciate if you photographed it, and then you could see the true quality of the image, the amazing figure in the middle. So in my view, it just doesn't make sense as a medieval image. There's another reason as well, and that's that the image is vanishingly faint. It's so faint that if you get closer than about 6 feet away, it melts into the cloth. You can't actually see it. So no one could have produced an image that they couldn't even see that when they were making it. From an artist drawing's point of view, there's another reason to doubt that this could be a medieval work of art. If you wanted to fake a holy shroud in the Middle Ages, you didn't need to create a forgery so brilliant that scholars like me and scientists working in the 21st century would be fooled by it. All you needed to do was to paint one. And what I've got on the right of the screen there is the Holy Shroud of Besançon. It's actually an accurate copy of it because it was destroyed in the French Revolution. Now, this was very obviously just a medieval painting. You can see how stylized it is. But until it was destroyed, this shroud was thought to be an authentic relic of Christ's burial. This image was thought to be a miraculous imprint. So you didn't need to forge the perfect forgery in the Middle Ages. People were gullible in those days, especially.
All right, so that's just what I wanted to make in terms of this first major point that there are tons of shrouds all around the medieval world, and they were all just paintings. They're all of the same quality. Well, as I just quoted Dr. Thomas de Westlo, he's an agnostic. He doesn't even believe in God, and yet he's admitting this. He's a professional art historian. But yeah, Otangelo, what's your thoughts on this kind of skeptical claim that there were tons of shrouds? There's nothing special about the Shroud of Turin's image.
Yeah, this was also one of the arguments made by one of the three heads, which at the British Museum made the radiocarbon C14 test, and they said, well, this was a big business in the Middle Ages. The relics to go around, show them to the public, and then making money with these relics. And certainly that was also the case with the Shroud of Turin. So what we know is that the Shroud of Besançon was just one of over 60 copies that we have of the shroud. So the shroud is actually the original, and then all these copies, they have been made based on the Shroud of Turin. So this is what is the real state of affairs. And interestingly, that often when a church required a copy of the shroud, in order to sanctify the copy, they did cut out a part of the original, a little bit of the cloth, and then they did send it together with the copy to the diocese or to the church or whoever ordered the copy. And that's also one of the reasons why they fixed probably one of the corners of the original shroud. So this is a very bad argument to say, well, the shroud isn't original because that was a big business back in these times there. Now, I think that Beslow, he provided a good point, which already this alone is such a powerful evidence, which is precisely the photonegative. This is unique. There isn't anything even close anywhere else out there. I mean, an image like this. And there have been made hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of tests and different scientific papers which have been published, and none of them has actually been able to demonstrate how a forger in the Middle Ages could have made this forgery of this. So I think this speaks volume, and in order to remain skeptic, one must simply to ignore all this data.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with you on that front. So, yeah, look, it is true. The shroud is totally unique. There's just nothing like it when we're talking about the minimal relevant features, especially those properties, physical and chemical properties. No medieval painting or artwork from the 14th century has these properties. So, yeah, all right. I think that's it for the kind of general introduction thing. Now, the first main topic that they get into is related to the history of the shroud. I don't know if you saw this part where they kind of summarize. Well, in the first place, they give a timeline. starting from the 14th century, which they assume is the starting point for the Shroud's history, and then they go into the future and into the present day. And I appreciated that because I actually did learn some things about the Shroud's history. I usually focus on the controversial bit. I never usually care what's happening to the Shroud in the 1700s. So I liked that they actually gave the known history timeline. But I noticed when they gave the timeline for the pre-medieval history of the Shroud, it was just totally blank. They had nothing. They said, look, there's no evidence at all that the Shroud predates the history. And they tried to describe the different theories that pro Shroud guys give there. And I found this was some basically their ignorance was a little exposed here, and they were very confused because they quoted Gary Habermas saying, well, some people like Gary Habermas think that the Shroud was just hidden in a wall until modern times. Then they quote the image of Edessa theory, and they say, well, the image of Edessa existed from the 6th century. There's no provenance to that between the first 500 years. And then they mentioned the Mandy Lion. So they treat these as though they're three separate histories for the Shroud, when in fact they're just different phases of one historical hypothesis, the image of Edessa hypothesis. So that was one thing I found that they really were confused on. They didn't realize that the image of Edessa says, look, for the first 500 years, the Shroud was taken to Edessa around 30 AD, 33 AD, and then about 20 years later, it was hidden in a wall to protect it from pagan persecutors, and then it stayed there for the next 500 years, where it was rediscovered in around the 540s in Edessa, and it became the image of Edessa for the next few centuries until 944, when it was brought to Constantinople and was given the name the Mandy Lion or the Mandylion. So, yeah, and the last thing I'll mention is in terms of the alternative histories, they didn't seem to be aware of Jack Marquardt's theory of the image of God incarnate hypothesis or the image of Beirut hypothesis. But yeah, well, in the first place, so Otangelo, what's your kind of take on how they handled the theories of the pre-medieval history? Did you see that part, or yeah, what did you think of that?
No, I didn't, but I think this is precisely one of the things that even if they, prior to making the stream, studied just 2 days, which is actually far too short time. I mean, I studied it for years, and I've dedicated a huge amount of time to write my books. So in my second book, for the forensics, I dedicated 200 pages just on the pre-1300 history. So there is a huge amount of information that we have. And even if they just dedicated 2 days, it would have been very easy with the search engines to find that there is a lot of information already in regards of the pre-1300 history. And this one is already powerful evidence that the Shroud doesn't go back just to 1350. But furthermore, we have also the Sudarium of Oviedo, which it is a confirmed and scientifically corroborated history down back to the 6th century, where we have books which are stored in the National Library in Paris, in France, of historians which mentioned the history of peregrines which went to Jerusalem and they saw the Sudarium of Oviedo, and this is already in books from the 8th century. And we know half the Sudarium of Oviedo. And in my understanding, besides the hypothesis or even theory of Joe Marino of the fixing of the corner of the cloth, which gave a wrong dating, the fact that Sudarium of Oviedo actually touched and is of the same individual, this is very powerful evidence that the Shroud itself is much older than just to 1350 because it covered the same individual. So we can, even based on that evidence, go back and say it must at least be have originated at least at the 6th century.
Yeah, that was another thing that I said was interesting because they didn't cover in their presentation at all from what I've seen. They the actual evidence that pro-shroud proponents use to try and argue that there is a pre-medieval provenance for the shroud. So that you mentioned the Sudarium of Oviedo. I think that is the most powerful in terms of the historical dating evidences because it
Yes.
forensically links
Yes.
the shroud and places it at the latest 6th century AD or earlier, right?
Yes.
Um, so that's something they didn't even mention. They didn't mention the Prey Codex or the argument from art history. They didn't mention the coins. So none of
Yes.
that was mentioned. It was just kind of a brief comment about, and they refer to documents that mention a sindon or a shroud, but we have no way to link those documents to the Shroud of Turin. I'm just kind of curious, in terms of the documentary evidence, do you think that there's good evidence from the historical documents that we can link one of these images not made with human hands and say that that actually is the Shroud of Turin as opposed to something else?
Yes, I think that Russ Brew is a specialist and he makes entire lectures on precisely this topic. And we do not have only paintings which have similarities to the shroud or also the Byzantine coins, the Solidus coins. We have also writings from the 4th century. We have writings from the 7th century, which clearly are related to the Shroud of Turin. So we have a wealth of information of writings, of paintings, of icons, of the history itself, the trajectory, pre-1300 trajectory of the shroud, as you briefly mentioned, and also the numismatic evidence is fantastic. I think that Giulio Fanti recently brought out a book, and there he shows coins from all Europe which have images of Christ, which is very similar to the man on the shroud with a bifurcated beard and other kind of evidence which links these coins to the shroud as a prototype which was used. And I think that the Pantocrator, this is absolutely amazing. I think that this is undeniable. I've made a superposition of the shroud with the image on the Pantocrator. I can show it here, and then it can be very clearly seen that the artist which painted the Pantocrator in the 6th century, 550 AD, he used the shroud as a template to make the image. So this is undeniable.
Gotcha. Yeah, I totally agree. In terms of those numismatic or coin evidence and stuff, I think Giulio Fonte has done amazing work
Oh,
in that book where he's calculated it out statistically. Oh, sorry, statistically, and it's like 99% probability that the person who made the face on the what are called gold solidus coins, they date to about 692 to 695 AD. They must have used the face on the Shroud of Turin as their template because there are a number of features that are unique to the Shroud of Turin, and specifically even including certain blood stains, which are depicted on the coin as tufts of hair and that sort of thing. And they correspond. So he's done a statistical analysis and said that they must be connected. Outside of that, there's also the work of Justin Robinson, who's actually a coin expert. This is what he does for a living. And he published in a secular peer-reviewed coin magazine or a journal called Coin News. His study of a later coin from the 1000, I think it dates to 1032 AD, but I don't know why that date stands out. It's somewhere in the 1000s AD during the Byzantine Emperor Michael. and they're these bronze folius coins. And again, he's published in a peer-reviewed journal in Coin News his argument that these actually date to the time of Jesus. Or sorry, these were copied from the Shroud of Turin's facial image. And yeah, I'll bring that up. I want to bring up an image. I'll do that once Otangelo comes back and I can let him talk and I can bring that up just to show you what I'm talking about. Now there is one thing in terms of the documentary evidence, and I might want to get Otangelo's take on this because there is a difference, and I think it's important for the Shroud skeptics to understand this, is that I actually disagree. Me and Otangelo have a disagreement because he does go for the image of Edessa historical hypothesis as the account for where the shroud was in pre-medieval times. And I will admit, this is by far the majority view. It's the view that was advanced by Ian Wilson. But there is the alternative theory of Jack Marquardt, which I kind of lean towards, which is called the image of God incarnate hypothesis. So the image of God incarnate, this is another cloth with an image on it that is supposedly called, forget the Greek, how to pronounce the Greek, archi pietra, meaning it's an image not made with human hands. And basically it gives an alternative history. It says the shroud went from Jerusalem to Antioch, not to Edessa, and was kept in Antioch for the first 400 years or so, up till it was hidden away. And then it was rediscovered in the 6th century and taken from Antioch to Constantinople, where it remained until the medieval period. But I'm just kind of curious, Otangelo, what's your take on Jack Marquardt's alternative history? Do you think there's any merit to that? Is there any of the evidence that he presents that you find interesting, or do you just think it doesn't merit attention compared to the image of Edessa?
There are images pre-6th century which show Jesus painted in the Roman Empire with short hair and no beard. But in the same time period, like in the 5th century, in the beginning of the 5th centuries, we have also images which show Jesus with a bifurcated beard.
Right.
Like in Ostia in Rome, there is an image like this, and there are others. So I think that there were people which actually knew and saw the shroud pre-6th century, pre-540, which is claimed that it was hidden until there. Now, of course, we don't know who had access to it, where it was stored, if it was hidden or so. We have too little information in regards of that. So, and there are 3, 4 different hypotheses about the history where that the shroud was stored in that time period. So I think it is very difficult to take a position precisely because we do not have sufficient information in regards of where it was stored. So I will remain without any idea or belief in regards of where it was until the 6th century.
Okay, so that is interesting there. So I didn't know that about you. So you're kind of agnostic in terms of the first 500 years, but then you definitely come the 6th century, you definitely think the image of Edessa, the evidence is strongest for that hypothesis on your end there.
To be honest, Dale, I really don't know where it was, but we know that in the 10th century, 940 or so, it was being negotiated with the Byzantine Empire, and so from Edessa it went to Constantinople. So it is possible that in that time period, at least from 500 to 900 and something, it was in Edessa. That is a good possibility, I guess.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, there is one other thing in terms of the evidence for predating the medieval period. They do in their show go a lot into the textile evidence, but one of the textile evidences they mention is the fold patterns, and they mentioned that from the folds, they can tell there's only one, according to them, one folding pattern. But what I found funny is that I don't think they know that there are multiple fold patterns, at least 6 different folding patterns that have been scientifically proven on the shroud. And at least 2 of these patterns, I think, prove that the shroud has to date before the medieval period. So I just want to kind of share my screen. I've got some clips on these folding patterns just before. Okay, everything's good. Now, just before so here's the coin newspaper on the bronze fullest coins by Justin Robinson, the coin expert. All right. So, but in terms of the folding patterns, so I wanted to give a heads up to my friend Pam Moon, and she gives thanks to me because on my show we brought this argument up. But she's just written a paper called "The Holy Shroud of Turin: Multiple Folding Patterns and Their Historical Significance." So make sure to find that for free on Academia, where she goes over these patterns, at least 6 different ones. But there are 2 of which can date the shroud before the medieval period. So the first is that Dr. John Jackson has found certain folding patterns which make the shroud consistent with the Byzantine icon known as the Man of Sorrows. So let me just play that clip on those patterns.
It's a controversial claim, but it seems to be supported by an intriguing series of features, now clearly revealed by high-definition images of the shroud. When lit from the side, the shroud image all but disappears, and from the shadows emerges another dimension, the cloth's accumulated folds. Watch again what happens when the lighting changes. Notice the horizontal creases the whole width of the cloth. Linen has a kind of memory. It creases, and if it's kept folded for long periods, these creases become permanent and a record of how the cloth has been kept. According to Dr. Jackson, it's data that can be used forensically to link the Man of Sorrows icon to the shrouds of Turin and Constantinople. Finally, the pattern suggested that there should be a fold here by the legs. And finally, grouped together below the crossed hands, along the whole cloth was folded during storage. He expected the pattern to repeat itself along the whole cloth. Surprisingly, it doesn't. There is no fold E between the head and the navel. Instead, just below the crossed hands, Jackson found no less than 4 closely packed folds grouped together in what he calls the F block. Finally, the pattern suggested that there should be a fold here by the legs. And sure enough, on close inspection there was, but oddly, it was shallower than the others. Jackson developed a program to simulate all the folds and concluded that they must have come from some kind of device, perhaps for storing the shroud. Jackson looked for clues in the Man of Sorrows icon. Not only did it depict the one area of the shroud that was free of fold marks, but it was invariably shown as something coming out of a box. Described by the Crusader Robert de Clary.
Well, all of them were calculated as to exactly where they were. If you remember the F block,
Yep.
the F block is this block here with the 4 folds around it.
Right.
And then we had an interesting problem. We could not explain why there was a missing fold.
Right.
So the solution we came up with was a weighted bar. It does some marvelous things for us. First of all, it keeps the front of the shroud taut, so you always have a good face that doesn't fluff like a sail.
Keeps it taut, yeah.
That's right. And then it also has a tendency to pull this down right on the other side of the F block, which gives us this sharp fold here.
So it
Okay, so I think you just before I go to the next thing, I want to go to you, Otangelo. Like, what do you think about these fold patterns that Dr. John Jackson has found, which he thinks could be corresponded with the Man of Sorrows icon? And he's hypothesized about this device that may have been used to explain these folds. Do you think that's some good evidence that the shroud's not medieval?
I think this is very interesting, and there is a hypothesis that during the period that the shroud was in Constantinople between 940 and 1204, that it was in the main chapel there in the Sophia church, and then every Friday they did show it, and they had mechanisms to lift it up and then down again. And it is very probable that they had an ingenious mechanism to do this work. And we see the evidence on the shroud with these folding patterns.
Sure. All right. And yeah, I think this is pretty convincing empirical evidence. And again, the two skeptics, they didn't know anything about this. Now they did mention the water stains, and believe it or not, there are actually fold patterns, a different fold pattern, evident by the water stains. And this, Pam Moon has argued, is actually consistent with a folding pattern where it would be in a vertical position, put in an ancient jar, Middle Eastern
Yeah.
jar, that had a little bit of water in the bottom.
Hmm.
And this is in Pam Moon argues this is inconsistent with the medieval date because they wouldn't have carried textiles in a jar like in the ancient Middle East. They would put it in a chest, a rectangular flat chest. So again, this is proof that the provenance of the shroud goes back to ancient times. What do you think of that? Do you think that's a good argument on your take?
Yeah, I think that all these marks, they are evidence that the shroud isn't just from the Middle Ages. But I think if they have focused very much on the tissue and on the linen cloth, we have pretty powerful evidence that this doesn't come from the Middle Age Europe, but from Palestine, eventually made in India or so, and then imported into Palestine and then sold there. It was a very, very expensive linen. And if an artist had the intention to make money, he wouldn't have used such an expensive linen, which is very fine. He would have chosen a one which is not so expensive. And then also the size is evidence that it has Babylonian sizes, and this is also consistent with what they used 2000 years ago. There are other evidence as well, like the strip, which is attached on the shroud, and the folding pattern of this strip is also equivalent. They only did find something similar in Masada. There are other kinds of evidence as well, but if you group all the 4 or 5 issues together, then we come to a very powerful conclusion that the linen itself doesn't point to Middle Age origin, but to Palestine 2000 years ago.
Sure. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, here's a video I did with Pam Moon. If you're interested, or starts around the 55-minute mark where she talks about these 6 different folding patterns, and virtually all of these, obviously this one's from 1532, but these all give a date that is inconsistent with the carbon-14 dating and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think the evidence is pretty clear on that front. Um, okay, so just want to see. Now, you mentioned some other things about textile studies, and they do give a considerable, I don't know if you saw this part or not, Otangelo, but they do give a considerable time to assessing the textile evidence of the shroud. And from what I heard, they gave 2 counter arguments against the shroud's authenticity. So the first is they say, kind of what you were just talking about, they say, well, no, that it's not true. The shroud is a very rich, and it's a 3-to-1 herringbone weave. And they quote Stephen Jones' blog, and they say, well, the only example of a 3-to-1 weave like this we have is from the medieval period. There's nothing like that, a complicated weave like that in the first century times. They couldn't make a cloth like that. And the
Yeah.
so go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, they don't know that we have a legging which was discovered in permafrost in South Tyrol, and it is made of wool, and it has a 2-to-2 herringbone wave, and it's dated 800 to 500 BC. If you want, I can put it here.
Yeah.
Anyone can have a look, but that disproves the claim that they didn't have this pattern 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. While you're bringing that up, and there are countless examples that I mentioned. There are even more complicated weaves. Egyptians had 4-to-1 weaves, 5-to-1 weaves, and stuff, and these all predate or date around the time of Christ and stuff like that. So we do have 3-to-1 and even more complicated weaves. Now, is it exactly the same as the shroud? No, there are always slight differences in how they make the cloths, but that's the same with the medieval example. The medieval example that you point to from Stephen Jones's blog, it's got some differences as well. But the point is, there's nothing technologically preventing them from making the shroud weave as we have it in the first century. Did you find that, or?
Yeah, I can quote here Dr. Mechtil Fleury-Lemberg. She says she has shown that the herringbone pattern existed not only during the first century of our era, but long before. She has published a study of woolen leggings, which I mentioned just before, found on the frozen remains of a man discovered in the permanent frost in South Tyrol in 1994. They are made of a coarse goat hair and woven in a 2.2 herringbone pattern. The leggings have been dated to 800 to 500 BCE. There are other examples, but I think claiming that this hasn't existed back then, that's simply not true. They should have made a further investigation, and then they would have found this information. Actually, I think even in the blog that you just mentioned, that there is this information.
Yep, absolutely. And the other objection they gave was based on Z spin, Z spin. However, I don't know. You're not an American, so I can say Z. Z
Yeah.
spin versus S spin
Mhm.
things, and they quote a noted textile expert. So I give them credit that they consulted an actual expert, Orit Shamir. Now, of course, Orit Shamir just happens to be a Shroud skeptic. Of course, they quoted the skeptical source, and that was it. They didn't quote other sources that, I on my blog, let me just show that. When I studied the textile evidences, I real seeker ministries.wordpress.com, and then in the search bar type in textile, and it'll be the first thing that pops up. But I quote a bunch of papers from textile experts, from pro shroud skeptics, and most importantly, neutral sources. So for example, Ada Grossi, I think, she's neutral. She has a great thing contradicting Orit Shamir, saying that no, there's nothing about the shroud that contradicts a first century origin in terms of the Z spin versus S spun, and any other factors. She really looks into the Jewish context. And I actually agree with Ada that I don't think the shroud is a burial shroud proper. It's actually a cloth that was intended for temple service, but because it had a flaw in it, it was discarded and sold to Joseph of Arimathea, and then in haste it was used as a burial shroud. But I'm just kind of curious, just off the top there, Otangelo, what do you make of Ada Grossi's argument? Do you think that the Shroud of Turin is an actual burial shroud, or do you think it could have been a temple cloth which was used in haste as such, or yeah?
No, I fully agree that with your hypothesis, and I can read here Stephen Jones. He says the yarn used to weave the Shroud of Turin is of very high quality, even spun, and it has been woven into an unusual fancy weave for the time, called 3-to-1 herringbone twill. The resulting cloth is very fine, with a density of 35 threads per centimeter, or about 89 threads per inch. To give some perspective, the finest surviving Egyptian mummy fabrics are 30 threads per centimeter. The thread is spun in a S-twist and woven in simple plain weave, one thread over, one thread under. So this was obviously a very, very expensive cloth. And why would a medieval artist have bought and spent much money just if his intention was to actually gain money with this? He would have bought something which wouldn't be so expensive. So I think it is very possible that indeed this wasn't a cloth intended for burial, but for temple service.
Absolutely. Awesome. Awesome. I'm glad we agree. I wasn't sure, but yeah, I'm glad you agree on that front. And the main point that I wanted to say here, I guess my main point is that they focused only on Orit Shamir, who again I recognize him as a scholar. I linked to his paper on my blog, but they didn't look at the totality of all the textile experts. And if they did, I quote about a dozen papers, peer-reviewed papers there. The vast majority of these textile experts all say the shroud is consistent with a first century date. So, for example, meth child Flori Lemberg, was the one in charge of the 2002 restoration project, and Irene Tomiti was working under her, who I've contacted personally through emails and stuff. And these are noted textile experts. It was meth child Flori Lemberg who was consulted to select the carbon-14 sample in 1988. Now, that didn't take place, but that's who the carbon-14 scientists originally wanted to be the one to select the sample. So that's the quality of her scholarship. And she's quoted as saying, look, the shroud is perfectly consistent with findings that we have of burial shrouds and linens from Masada dating to about 70 to 73 AD in the first century, based on the seam. So this is a perfect fit. I also wanted to quote John Tyer's paper. Again, that's on my blog, because he's a textile expert from the University of Manchester, and he was studying certain X-radiograph images of the shroud. And he actually said, well, this disproves it can't be medieval. The shroud, by comparison, it's too rough. It's not the same quality as medieval fabrics. It's too shoddy. So yeah, we have textile experts actually disproving a medieval date. Are you familiar with John Tyer's study there and on your end?
No, I am not. But I think another thing worth to be mentioned is that there are no examples of herringbone twill weave from France up to and including the 14th century. There is in fact only one known example of a medieval herringbone twill linen wave fabric, a 14th century block painted linen fragment with a 3-to-1 chevron twill weave in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So this goes also against the hypothesis that it is from Europe and the medieval.
Now that was because that's the exact thing they quoted. The skeptics quoted in their. I should have probably been playing clips of them along the way, but they quoted that. So you're saying that doesn't support what they're saying. This medieval example isn't a 3-to-1 twill. Is that?
Let me check here. It is. There is in fact only one known example of a medieval herringbone twill linen weave fabric, a 14th century block painted linen fragment with a 3-to-1 chevron twill weave in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So there is one.
Okay. So fair enough. So that would support the shroud skeptics there. But again, the point that I'm making is that there are other textile considerations, such as John Tyer's study, which actually rule out the shroud as being a medieval product. So it's not just about, okay, well, do they have a 3-to-1 twill? Because as textile experts can attest, they are able to make that kind of weave in the first century or in the medieval period. It doesn't help us to adjudicate, kind of thing.
Right. Now let me quote this. I think this is very interesting. The variegated patterns known as banding in both the warp and weft yarn suggest that the yarn was bleached before weaving rather than after the cloth was taken from the loom. This is a significant clue to the age of the cloth because medieval European linen was field bleached, a process that eliminates banding.
Gotcha. Yeah, the banding is definitely an issue kind of thing. Placing it pre-medieval times. For sure, I think that proves that the carbon-14 dating is wrong. It's inconsistent with that much. So it's not like that consideration puts us back to the first century, but it rules out the medieval date that the Shroud skeptics are advocating for sure. I think it
There is
has.
another, there is another
Oh,
detail, even more important, is the absence of any wool fibers, which certainly would have been present on any European loom. Therefore, the shroud is not of European origin.
yeah, I think that's suggestive of a Jewish provenance, right? Because it's got to be what is that? Shatnaz and kosher for a more common word, right? Because look,
Yeah,
you can mix they do know that there's been cotton found at least in that part of the shroud where we'll be talking more about later when we get to the carbon-14 next. You can mix cotton and linen all day long and still be kosher, but wool, that would be forbidden for Jews to mix in their cloths, right? You can't accept that. So from what I've seen of the textile experts, this is suggesting a Middle Eastern Jewish provenance, not European, as you were saying. So I totally agree.
yes.
All right. All right. Well, I think we should kind of skip ahead then because we've hinted at the carbon-14 dating, and oh boy, do they go into a lot of detail in the carbon-14 dating. And I'll just say I guess I'll go first. So basically there are a number of attempts to explain why did the carbon-14 go wrong. Or yeah, by way of introduction, actually. So when it comes to the carbon-14 dating, I see that there are two main aspects that you need to study. So the first is why should we believe that the results that they got are in fact accurate or not accurate, right? And that's where I get into my three problems. So number one, they only dated one sample location. Even Harry Gov admits that's not a sufficient sample size. Secondly, there's the evidence that suggests the location they dated, the sample they dated, was not representative to the rest of the cloth. And Otangelo will be getting into that. And then there's the statistical problems, which they dealt with separately from their assessment of the radiocarbon, but you can't because this is all the data that has to go together. So that number one, there's the average dates they got, the 1260 to 1390. But you also have to explain the range of dates that they got, and most importantly, the gradient or the slope. So this is what they were talking about in terms of the heterogeneity of the results they got. But there is this slope of 36 years per centimeter. The shroud gets younger 36 years per centimeter as you go from the edge towards the center of the cloth. Whatever explanation you have has to explain all that data. So on that front, that's where we get to the second aspect of, okay, well, how did pro shroud guys explain? Why did a first century cloth give us an erroneous medieval date? And, there have been various explanations, about 5 different types. So the first were conspiracy theories, right? The Russians hacked the computers, or they swapped out samples. The second is ordinary contamination, things like wax, tallow, smoke, fire. A lot of people talk about, touching the bacteria, stuff like that. Then there's the other form of ordinary contamination, which is invisible reweave. It's an invisible reweave sewn in. But then there are 2 forms of extraordinary contamination as well. So the first is by Dr. John Jackson, the carbon monoxide contamination. And this was actually tested for scientifically in 2008 by Oxford Radiocarbon Labs, and it was scientifically falsified. So this doesn't work as an explanation. We know that now. But then there's the fifth, which is the one I'm going to go for, the neutron radiation. And I just want to say, in the first place, we'll come to the neutron radiation in more detail in a bit, but just want to say before I turn it over to Otangelo, um, I thought that the skeptics' treatment of the neutron radiation was very weak. In the first place, it seemed like they had no idea about Bob Rucker's work on that front and his MCNP computer calculations, which he's an actual nuclear engineer and an expert in this area using the government's software, US government's software, the Monte Carlo neutron particle software to do his calculations. There was no discussion of Bob's hypothesis on that front, or Dr. Thomas McAvoy's subsequent confirmation in applied optics of that theory. They really just pointed to, well, neutrons, that would be a miracle, and that's ridiculous. We just dismiss it. And Fonte's work in terms of the blood and the lack of nitrogen, that's a farce. So we can dismiss neutron radiation. So I thought there needed to be more work there, and I'll come to that. But in the first place, I want to turn it to you, Otangelo, because they did cover in a lot of detail the invisible reweave and concluded that that doesn't work. It's ridiculous and that sort of thing. So I want to turn it to you. Like, first of all, what is the invisible reweave hypothesis? Why do you believe it? And what did you make of some of their assessments on that front?
Well, I think that the reweave hypothesis, which was brought forward by Joe Marino, is actually compelling because we know that in the Middle Ages, the shroud was exposed hundreds of times in public expositions, and all the time they were just holding it at the corners of the cloth. This is one reason why it wore out. The second is that, as I told before, they were actually cutting small snippets of the cloth, and they did give it away together with copies of the shroud. And so over time, it got really worn out and had to be fixed. And it is perfectly valid the possibility that they just used different kind of cloth and then reweaved it to fix the damaged corners. So I see no reason why to doubt it. And furthermore, we have also the Ray Rogers investigation, and in 2005, he published a science paper, and before he was a skeptic of this hypothesis, and then he became convinced that really, indeed, it is pretty much possible that it was fixed based on the scientific investigation which he did, where he did find dye and colors and glue and so forth. So I think this is a compelling hypothesis. But interestingly, I can quote here what one of the investigators of the radio 3C14 carbon datings actually had to say, this was Professor Michael Tighty. He did write a letter back then, and he wrote, as a coordinator of the test and the director of the research laboratory at the British Museum, he acknowledged after the complete report was published in Nature that the C14 dating was not sufficient to establish that the Shroud of Turin was a fake. He clarified that such a claim goes beyond the evidential scope of the results obtained and attributed the misinterpretation of his words to the media. Presented here, and there is a letter which is from 1989 where he says that. He says, I myself do not consider that the result of the radiocarbon dating of the Turin shroud shows the shroud to be a forgery. So I think this is a very important voice to be quoted, from one of the team of the investigators. So, and then another very important thing is, how is it possible that 25 different tests during the 1978 STIRP investigation were performed with dozens of science papers being published in 1981, and the conclusion was that it was not a forgery. And they didn't know and didn't be able to explain how the image was made. I think that comparing 25 tests with just the radiocarbon dating and dismissing it, that is simply insane. I think we should go where the majority of the evidence leads to. And this is what most people simply do not do. They just hold to one test, which is highly controversial, and then simply dismiss all the other evidence which shows the contrary, that there is no evidence that this is an artifact of an artist from the Middle Ages.
Yeah, that's a great point. We're going to come to the image formation after we finish the carbon-14, actually. But I just want to make this point that you make so excellently, that you have to consider the totality of the evidence. Look, when it comes to the historicity of the shroud, the historical authenticity of the Shroud of Turin, there are a total of 18 that I've counted lines of argumentation and evidence that suggest either a first century date, or at the very least that the shroud can't be medieval in terms of being consistent with the 14th century date. On the other hand, there are literally at most 3 lines of argumentation or evidence that support the 14th century date. There's the carbon-14 dating evidence. There's the textile evidence, which we kind of already looked at prior and shown that it's actually not that good. And then there's the Darcy memorandum. They covered that right in the beginning of actually, you know what? They skipped the Darcy memorandum, interestingly. They mentioned the Pilgrim's badge, and then they talked about the Pope's bull, about, saying it's just a representation or an image. So yeah, okay, here's what I'll do. So let's start with the carbon dating. I'm kind of interested with the invisible reweave. Obviously, I disagree with that myself. So I actually side with the Shroud skeptics because I think neutron irradiation is the better hypothesis. But the skeptics do actually raise some objections to the invisible reweave. Did you see that part or no?
No, I didn't, but I know what the objections are.
Okay,
So
let me just quickly.
I think Bob Rucker also doesn't go with it. He
Yeah.
also raises some compelling reasons to reject it. I actually even asked Joe Marino what he thinks about his objections. So I've gone into it.
Okay, let me just play a clip of what the skeptics themselves said, because they appealed to Dr. John Jackson. So is that showing up there?
Yes, I can see the screen.
Okay.
Remember, this is where they're saying
in a very subtle way. And this striation pattern that's systemic to the shroud in a very subtle way, but we just don't see anywhere any kind of disruption.
So here, right, this is this high quality image of the shroud before the radiocarbon sample was taken from here. And I don't know where this invisible weave is supposed to be visible.
Well, you just
but
answered
not
your own
visible.
question. It's
What's
invisible.
invisible? Yeah, okay, great.
Okay, so that's it for the clip. But you can see what they said is 2 things. So they said Dr. John Jackson argues these striations, do they go across the cloth, even into what's supposedly the invisible reweave section? And they say that that's kind of a falsification of it. And then the other thing they say, which I didn't show, is that they say we know about invisible reweaving and it shouldn't be invisible. You should always see it. So I'm just kind of curious, like, what are your comebacks to these?
Yeah, they are saying that the backside of the cloth should show precisely how it was reviewed. There should be traces of that, and there aren't there on the shroud. And I think this is a good counter argument, which I personally I don't think that there are good objections to that argument, so it is valid. I don't think we can say much more about it.
All right, fair enough. All right, cool. So yeah, the thing that I wanted to say in terms of the neutron radiation, and after this we'll move on from the carbon-14, but I think that look, in terms of refuting the skeptics, I don't care if it's an invisible reweave. I'm happy if I find out that's right. Great. The bottom line is it's not provably medieval. Or there's the neutron radiation that I go with, along with Bob Rucker. If that's true, great. Again, the shroud is not medieval. And they were very dismissive of this, even as a possibility, just because it is miraculous in nature, right? Positing neutrons from within the body during a resurrection event, affecting and throwing off the carbon-14 data. But one thing I wanted to say is that this isn't just some ad hoc, or I think they called it a post hoc rationalization. Beyond that, Bob Rucker has done calculations which just happen to match. And we also have other evidence that correspond. So, for example, the Sudarium of Oviedo, we both agreed that's connected. But that gave a carbon-14 date of 700 AD. Well, that just happens to match Bob Rucker's neutron radiation calculation. So this is supporting evidence. And beyond that, in the journal Applied Optics, so this is not just a predatory publishing journal, as the skeptics were saying all shroud research is just in predatory journals, it's puff pieces, there's no credibility. No, this was in Applied Optics. So I dare you to say that about them. But this is research from Dr. Thomas McAvoy. He was on my show where he's looking at the ultraviolet fluorescence. And guess what? It just happens to match the Bob Rucker's calculations here. So let me very quickly bring that up. Okay, get rid of this. So I think it's a 10-minute clip, but I'll try to skip over parts.
And what Stirp did was they took photos down 3 different straight lines. They had a little carriage mechanism, and they would move it down the shroud. And arising from the body covered by the shroud could, 1, alter its radiocarbon dating and create long-lived radioactive isotopes of chlorine and calcium in the shroud. It does not account for the image formation. Okay, and it's just a very brief, it's almost like 1-page letter to the editor. I became familiar with, and I've actually interacted with Bob Rucker and what he did, and he published this in 2014 and is working on it, and has worked on it since. But he simulated neutron radiation. He actually simulated Phillips' hypothesis. And his main assumption is that in the simulation is that the thermal neutrons were emitted homogeneously, or uniformly, if you will, from within the body, and isotropically, or uniformly, in all directions. And the simulation then calculated radiocarbon dates for various points on the shroud. And he has here, there are 2 schematics I've taken from Bob's papers. One shows how the body in the shroud was laid out, the top one, and then the bottom one shows his model of the tomb. And you can see that to the right of the body, there's a wall. To the left, there's empty space. And he had this code that I believe he had worked on when he was at the lab out in Washington, that he used for his simulations. And he ran a bunch of Monte Carlo simulations. And here's what he got in terms of his radiocarbon dating. And this is now down the center. He had results down the whole shroud. I'm just showing the center image here. And if you look at the circle, you can see that comes from the area of the shroud that was actually radiocarbon dated. And you can see there's a pretty significant gradient there. And we saw when we looked at the numbers, it was about 90 years per inch. So there's a pretty steep gradient over there. And
so sorry to interrupt the video, but one thing that the skeptics were saying, because they were ignorant of Bob Rucker's research, is they were kind of laughing and mocking the fact that, well, if Bob Rucker's argument is correct, then if you date certain areas towards the center of the cloth, you're going to get an even younger date. There's no way to get a first century date. And I just wanted to say that, yeah, that's the whole point. And it gets even weirder. Bob, if you were to date around the chest of the shroud man on the frontal image, we would get a future date. It would carbon date to 8500 AD. So this is an excellent prediction Bob's model makes that we can test and potentially falsify his hypothesis here. So this is actually a good thing. But I just wanted to clarify that because the skeptics were kind of not understanding about how Bob's understanding of the neutron radiation works. But let me just finish off just a couple more minutes, and you'll see the amazing correspondence that is confirming evidence from the ultraviolet here.
As you get closer to the center of the shroud, then it becomes younger and younger and younger, and eventually you wind up having it date to the future. But these are his results, and the x-axis or the y-axis here are the radiocarbon dates that he's calculating. When I plot my UV results, and again, the UV are results from the shroud, I was amazed. I got the same type of curve or plot. You can see that there's a double maximum. The dorsal image or the back image is on the left in both cases, and the frontal image is on the right. The biggest maximum occurs in the dorsal image, and it occurs right around the torso area of the body. And the frontal image, the same thing. The maximum occurs around the torso area of the body. But to me, these were pretty amazing. I mean, this is like saying I've got an orange and I've got an apple, and somehow the orange looks like the apple or the apple looks like the orange. And here are Bob's conclusions from his neutron simulation. The radiocarbon dating values are highest. Radiocarbon dating, then the bottom of the same intensity be affected by neutron radiation? Or could the apple be an orange? Now,
as you can see, that remarkable correspondence is there. And basically, he's just explaining that. He went on to say, well, can we prove that ultraviolet fluorescence, neutron irradiation would affect the ultraviolet fluorescence? And he did scientific experiments published in Applied Optics and proved they would. And it would correspond in exactly the way we were seeing with this correlation here and lead to the same results. So I think that's remarkable, confirming evidence of the neutron radiation. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's very interesting. But another thing which I think is often overlooked is we cannot be actually so confident even on radiocarbon dating itself. And Meacham, he made here a nice graph, and he said that trustworthy is only about 68%, and then unacceptable is 22% of the datings, and very doubtful is 9.6%. So just saying, okay, they came up with that dating, we have to accept it, and that's it, and it disproves the shroud. Just forgetting all the other evidence which contradicts this result, I think this is not reasonable to proceed that way.
Yeah, definitely. You need to. I do feel that there is so I think that carbon dating in general is reliable, but there's so many things that can interfere. The contamination is a well-known thing that affects it, and we get a lot of wrong dates, right? So for the famous young Earth examples of snails carbon dating 2400 AD or something like that. So there's definitely problems. And look, we have actual evidence, empirical evidence that the shroud is one of these problematic areas. So you should have no confidence in the 1988 results. I think you're unwarranted in placing your trust that the shroud is actually medieval on the basis of those carbon dates. So yeah, I totally agree with you. I think we should throw it out. It doesn't work.
I think you should put all the scientific evidence on the table. And if there is contradicting information, then compare one to the other and look where does the gross information or evidence lead to into what direction. And we have so many different lines of evidence that we can actually put on the table and then compare. And I think that overwhelmingly all the evidence points to an authentic 2,000-year-old cloth and a miraculous make of the image.
Gotcha. What I guess I'll ask one follow-up. You let me know if you want to answer, if we should move on. But one of their points, and I've gotten this criticism from Hugh Ferry before, is that pro-shroud people, they're contradictory with their answers to the carbon-14. So they were kind of laughing at Father Andrew Dalton because he'll talk about touching the bacterial contamination while at the same time advancing invisible reweave. Or in my case, Hugh Ferry has criticized me because I will appeal to evidence for the invisible reweave, but at the same time, I don't believe in the invisible reweave. I go for the neutron radiation. So they see that as kind of a contradiction. Like, why are you guys giving evidence from different theories? So I'm just curious, what's your take on that? And I'll give my take afterwards. But is it wrong for us to appeal for evidence for different theories to refute the carbon-14?
I think we should investigate all possibilities, and then anyone can make up its mind and think about what seems to be the most compelling or what not. I mean, in each line of evidence, you have pros and contras, and also in regards of the reweave, you have evidence that favors the hypothesis, and then there are some things which seem to contradict and refute it. And so also with other lines of evidence. So I think we should be honest enough and simply say, okay, there is contradicting evidence, and then leave it by that, and then anyone can make up its mind. What I think is dangerous is just to rely to one line of evidence when there are many, many others which also should be taken into consideration to come to a truth assessment, which most likely shows the real situation of the issue in question.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I don't really need to go into a long answer because you just answered me there. I think, look, this is a question of epistemic warrant or justification on the part of the skeptic who claims to know the shroud is medieval. And on that front, I'm at liberty to provide undercutting defeaters from various theories, even if those theories are mutually exclusive, even if there's a 1% probability. So let's take a look at the conspiracy theories, right? I think that is extremely improbable. I don't believe that there is a conspiracy to fraudulently switch samples or that Russian hackers did that. But if there's even like a 0.01% possibility, I think we should present the evidence and, okay, here's a hypothesis. Here's the evidence for or against that, and let's consider it all. It should all play a role in undercutting your degree of warrant because you have that burden of proof to prove that no, conspiracies didn't happen. No, an invisible reweave didn't happen. No, neutron irradiation didn't happen. And in fact, it's a problem because Oxford used petroleum in their cleaning procedures. Great. If you're going to make that claim, skeptic, you have to prove it. You have to disprove all the other defeaters against it. So, yeah, I agree with what you were saying there. So, all right, well, I think that's everything in terms of the carbon dating. I guess we can look at the image formation because you brought that up. And they cover at least 2 to 3 hours on the image formation question. And the hypothesis they think is the best, and maybe I should look for a clip just to show the people, but is Luigi Garlascelli's powder rubbing or frottage method. So while I look for a clip, I'm gonna turn it to you to what is your take on Luigi Garlascelli? They say this replicates all of the features. It's game over. The shroud is an artistic fake.
Dale, when they came out, this experiment was actually ordered by an Italian skeptics organization back in 2008 or 2009, something like that. And the result was so ridiculously bad that the critics, even the skeptics themselves, they said, well, you guys did shoot yourself into the foot because this shows how distant that the result is from the original. I mean, if you compare the original with the image that they came up with, it is day and night difference. It is a huge difference. So that by actually no means at all corroborates that someone in the Middle Ages using the techniques that Carla Skelly used could have produced the shroud with the details, with the 2D information in there, with the photonegative effect, with the 3D information as well, with the superficiality of the image itself. I mean, there are so many unique characteristics which nobody really has been able to replicate that. So if their result or inference or conclusion is that because of what Carla Skelly came up with, we can confidently say that the shroud is a forgery, then I would say I am sorry, but I actually don't even know any shroud expert which takes this investigation seriously and is a skeptic that he uses Carla Skelly's work to justify its inference that the shroud is a forgery. So if they came to that conclusion based on Carla Skelly's work, so I'd say this is a joke.
Yep, I totally agree. I think that Luigi Garlascelli's hypothesis. Well, okay, let me say this on the positive end. I will admit that Garlascelli, in terms of the results he got, he has come the closest in terms of an ordinary artistic mechanism in terms of fooling the lay people that he's reproduced the shroud, right? He even went to the extent of trying to reproduce the scourge wounds, blood stains, frontal, dorsal, and even the scorches from the 1532 fire. So on a superficial level, I think he's done the best. Even Gary Habermas has told me this. But when you look into the details, as you're saying, no, it falls far short. And in fact, I think sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. It is very distant.
yeah, I actually think if you're going to go for an ordinary artistic mechanism, I think that Dr. Colin Berry's toastograph hypothesis is actually the best in terms of reproducing the features, but even it utterly fails. It can't reproduce the features. But just focusing on Garlascelli, look, we've done scientific experiments reproducing his method, and I'm trying to bring that up. So there are various areas where it fails. So, for example, the three-dimensionality, the bas relief, contrary to what shroud skeptics, even Hugh Ferry and others might claim, it doesn't reproduce the quality of three-dimensionality that we see on the shroud. And this is especially so with Garlascelli's technique itself. And because of that, it fails to achieve the vertically mapped wrapping distortions, as even shroud skeptic Cicero Mores shows. He tested out a bas relief, and maybe I'll try to find his thing recently, right? But it doesn't give us the perfectly vertically mapped process that we see with the Shroud of Turin. There's always going to be lateral distortions, even with a shallow bas relief, where the image will be slightly wider than it should look.
Yeah.
So right there, it's an utter failure. And same with superficiality. It utterly fails there. And there's no evidence of dry powder, which is one of Garlashelli's techniques, let
Yeah.
alone this acidic, slurry pigment concoction that he's come up with. So it actually contradicts the evidence we have. But here's the most incredible thing is Dr. Garlashelli himself has in person and in writing admitted that his technique just utterly fails to reproduce the shroud on some of these features. So the man himself is saying his theory sucks. It doesn't work. So
That's maybe the reason why he refused until today to have a debate with any shroud research, maybe.
hey, so I just did a show, a Shroud Wars podcast, evaluating Luigi Garlashelli and Hugh Ferry's hypothesis. I reached out to Garlashelli, heard crickets. He doesn't want to come on to defend his technique. So
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
here in Brazil there is an Italian guy which he said to me, "Hey, do you want to debate Carlos Kelly?" And I said, "Yes, of course. Call him. I'm ready anytime. I'm
absolutely.
waiting until today." So,
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I'm sorry. I wish they had done more research. It looked like the Shroud Skeptics, what they did is I give them credit. They read and used Garlis Kelly's 25-page paper at least. So they're not just relying on like Pine Creek Doug on some clip on CNN. At least they're better than that. But it looks like they just blindly believed whatever he said in that paper and took it as gospel. They didn't look at some of the counter responses from people like Thibaut Heimberger or others who had actually replicated Garlashelli's experiments and discovered these flaws that come up in his method, and that he, when challenged in certain panel discussions, I had Mark Guskin who spoke to Garlashelli in person at one of these panel discussions, and he was fully admitting all these problems. So
yeah.
it doesn't work, guys. Yeah.
I mean that's precisely the moment when you see if someone is actually honest about it or not. And if you really believe that what Carlos Kelly came up with refutes the authenticity of the shroud, then I'd say I'll put a big question mark to the honesty of the investigation and the neutrality. So I am sorry, but hey, they should have come up with other reasons to say that the shroud seems to be a forgery than to bring up his work, because that is really very, very unconvincing.
Yeah. Yeah, and to their credit, they did mention other theories as well, such as that were all similar. So they mentioned Joe Nichols' powder rubbing. Obviously, he originated that technique or popularized it at least. And they mentioned Craig Imbrizi's dusting technique, but all of these suffer from similar problems to Garlashelli because they're all kind of the same category of mechanism. Okay. Well, what about their take on radiation theories then? So they're clearly aware that pro shroud guys appeal to radiation, and that actually, sorry, scratch that. Before I get onto the radiation, they did give a very brief analysis of Walter McCrone's work, and they just said this. They're like, look, we didn't have time to research it fully. They couldn't make heads or tails of who was right. They said it looks like there's contradictory evidence on both sides, and they kind of left it as like we don't know what the truth is. Is it painted or not? So I guess I just want to turn it to you. What's your take on Walter McCrone's work? Is there actually pigments composing these images and stuff like that?
That was actually a part where I was interacting in the side chat when they brought up this issue. And uh, I mean, Giulio Fanti, he brought up a very interesting paper where he explains that there are actually some red ochre pigments, but only where the blood stains are, which is evidence that someone a few hundred years ago tried to enhance the color of the blood and then used some color pigments to do so. But there aren't pigments on the whole cloth which would explain the origin of the entire image, the back and forth image. So this isn't evidence that refutes the authenticity of the shroud.
Okay, but now, believe it or not, these shroud skeptics were smart enough. I think from reading Garlashelli's work, and they were smart enough to go, well, of course, Walter Macron's wrong. The images themselves, as we see them today, are not composed of paint. But they say at a certain point, after a few centuries or so, the paints were washed off or taken off or worn away. They were gone in some fashion. And what we see is the residue of the acid leaving behind the images. What do you think of that? Does that solve the problem? Could it have been painted originally and then they lost it?
No, if that would be the case, then they would have found traces which would have been a hint precisely to that process. But that's not the case, definitely. We know that it is a zero point 0.2 microns on the very superficiality of the linen that is the reason for the formation of the shadows, darker and lighter color, and that cannot be formed by this process which they assume or hypothesize.
Yeah, not even in the crevices of the threads, which would be expected, right? If it was washed off, there would be a much more evidence for these compounds, especially in like the crevices of the threads and stuff like that. But it's not there. So
And
okay,
Giulio Fanti, he showed that there are threads which are darker, and then right next to it there are threads which are fully clear. And you would find uniformity if that process would have been applied. So an artist would have had to color each single linen strand in
yeah,
order to get this effect, and that's simply just not feasible.
yeah, individual. So he's referring to the body image uniformity. And by the way, that's another area where these Luigi Garlashelli fails. Even in his own paper, there's a picture of like the blue. I wish I had it ready to go to show you. Let me I'll try to bring it up after just to show you guys. Where is it? Uh okay, well just take my word for it. If I can find it later on, I will show it. But Garlashelli published his own result. Those are not uniformly colored images. They're different patches all over the place. It's nothing like the Shroud of Turin on a
Yeah,
microscopic level. So
yeah,
that's
correct.
another feature it fails.
I mean, we know also that he published another paper in 2018 related to the blood stains, and that was also so badly researched that he was very badly criticized by experts, by people which actually understand these things. And I mean, he is absolutely no credible source whatsoever in any regard, any topic related to the shroud. So relying on him to say the shroud is a forgery, that's just ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, I found it and then okay, here it is. So I'm just going to share my screen. Here's what I was talking about with the uniformity, just so the audience can see. These are Luigi Garlashelli's own photos, right? So you can see these are not uniform. See the little spots patching it. So this is of the pigments on the threads. This is not like the Shroud of Turin at all. These are not uniformly colored images. So yeah, that's what we were talking about there. But yeah, Otangelo, I want to turn it to you then. What about the radiation hypotheses? Because this is something admittedly they didn't go into any research from what I saw. They knew some buzz terms like corona discharge. They didn't know what it was. They knew that pro shroud guys like to appeal to radiation at the time of Jesus' resurrection, but their main objection was like, why are we getting into these details? God, why not just say God did it? If God can do a miracle, why would he use radiation or corona discharges or any of this stuff. He would just snap his fingers and make shroud images, right? That was kind of their only objection to the radiation is you're appealing to magic, and if so, why doesn't God just make them without using radiation and all this?
Well, somehow the image would have had to be made in order to appear physically. So, and I think that this is really the interesting stuff where they should have dived into and not spending so much time into less relevant topics, because this is something which is then really fascinating when you understand what the closest hypothesis is. And I think that Paolo Di Lazzaro did a great job with his experiments. And he, in my understanding, he comes very close to explain what probably the cause was. And he says that it was a very high energy burst of UV light that formed the image. And that is also why it is not distorted. So many say, well, if someone would have just laid a cloth on the body, then you line it up, it will be totally distorted. So we know that the radiation was perpendicular to the cloth in order to have precisely the matching anatomical the right sizes and not a completely distorted face and so forth. So another very fascinating thing is the precise fine tuning which was necessary in order to get this effect. And there was an experiment by Lind, a physicist, in 2017, and his inference from the experiments that he did was either the radiation was too low, then there would be no image whatsoever on the shroud, and if it would have been too strong, it would have burned the cloth. So it had to be the exactly right amount of energy in order to have the effect that we see on the cloth. So the God which fine-tuned the universe fine-tuned the image on the cloth, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. I think Bob Rucker's argued much the same in terms of the fine-tuning aspect that would be needed. But yeah, just in terms of my take, obviously, so just so the audience knows, the two skeptics, James Fodor and Nathan, I forget his Ortland, is that his last digital Gnosis?
Yeah, Ormond, Nathan Ormond. Yeah.
So they've agreed to come on my show. So I will be doing kind of a discussion show. And Otangelo, if they agree, hopefully Otangelo will be back as well. But we're going to be discussing some of their stuff with the Shroud Skeptics as well. So look out for that. But the thing I wanted to mention is I don't understand the skeptical objections. Like it does seem like it's just an anti-supernatural bias, and the God did it thing. They think they claim that the reason we appeal to radiation is because it lends credibility to us. Whereas if we just say God did it, we look silly. But in the first place, I don't think it's silly at all. Like God, for all the radiation theories, God did it. God started the initial process, and then the laws of nature took over. And that's great. If we can follow in a cause and effect manner, and when the skeptics are on, I'll play a clip of Bob Rucker and his vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis, because he goes through cause and effect sequential order where God does the initial event and then everything follows one after the other in terms of cause and effect in accordance with natural law. That's great. God gave us a means of understanding how he did something up to a certain point where the miracle came in and then the laws of nature take over. It's the same with the virgin birth, right? God did a miraculous conception, then the laws of nature took over. The fetus developed naturally and normally in the womb. It was a normal birth and that sort of thing. At least if you're a Protestant, Catholics have a different opinion, but yeah, the laws of nature, God does a miracle. He inputs a supernatural event into the system, and then the system takes over in terms of cause and effect. That's the same for every miracle that you can think of, and even the fine-tuning of the universe, right? If you go for something like God did it. He created the origin of the universe, but then the laws of nature took over and the universe expanded, and we can trace that back. That why is that something to be avoided or to be mocked? That God gave us clues as to how certain the images were formed on the shroud and or how the universe was formed. That's a good thing. So like I've never understood that objection from the skeptics. Like why would we expect God to do it in a totally inexplicable way or a mysterious way? No, he wants us to learn and grow and learn how he does things and the mechanics of the universe. That's a good thing.
Well, I see it like this. Either everything is a miracle or nothing is a miracle. And why are we not surprised to see a fine-tuned universe? Because we are just used to it. But if we think deeper about our reality, it is motivation to be astounded by all physical reality, you
Mhm.
know? So people, they are incredule in regards of the miracles that are described in the New Testament that Jesus performed, but they take it as completely normal that the universe is stable and intelligible, while that's not just a given. Why is the universe stable? It could be completely chaotic and um, unorganized, and then we wouldn't even be here.
Yeah.
So, uh, I
Yeah,
mean, if
the
someone thinks,
anthropic principle. Sorry.
yeah, I mean, if someone thinks through all these things, I think the honest conclusion to come to is that everything was created by an unimaginably powerful and unfathomably intelligent creator. We cannot understand or imagine it, but it is reasonable to believe that this God created everything and performed the miracles that are described in the Gospels.
Yeah. Well said. I've never understood skeptics that think the anthropic principle is a good rebuttal to the fine-tuning argument of the universe. Like just
It
saying like,
isn't a
oh,
rebuttal at all because it is
yeah,
a circular argument. It says,
exactly.
well, if it wasn't fine-tuned, we wouldn't be here. Okay, of course not. But the question is, why is there fine-tuning rather than not? That's the crux which the entropic principle doesn't actually address.
Exactly. Yeah, well said. I totally agree with you on that. Okay, all right. Well, I have one last major topic segment that they covered for at least an hour and a half, right towards the end, before they got into the contrasting explanations conclusions. But that's the Waxis dating, right? So they really go after Giulio Fonte. They claim he's a crank. He engages in predatory publishing. So the first half of it, which I didn't appreciate, really seemed like ad hominem attacks to kind of poison the well against his findings. I will say this though, I look, I can understand if it's good to be skeptical. Giulio Fonte is upfront that he's got a bias. He is biased in favor of the pro shroud. He believes that thing is authentic. But that doesn't mean that just because he's got a bias that you can't trust his work. Let his work stand on its own merits because he has done very credible scientific work. So I understand. I don't blame the skeptics for being skeptical. Like, well, hey, this guy admits he's a Christian and he believes the shroud's authentic, and he's actively going out doing research trying to prove that. Great, but let the work speak for itself. So that's the first thing I wanted to say in terms of my assessment. The well, yeah, let me turn it to you though. In terms of the actual Waxis method itself, they basically said this. This was their objection. So they appealed to the fact that Giulio Fonte was selective in the samples that he was using, right? He only used samples from Egypt and Israel that have very stable temperatures. He didn't test in fabrics from Europe where we could, get differences. And the second thing is the main complaint they had was, well, this method is very unstable because it's reliant on temperature, it's reliant on humidity factors and all these things, which we just can't know for an object like the shroud that's been around for centuries, even if it's just medieval. We don't know everything about its history and its condition. So what do you make of these objections to the wax dating method? Can we have any confidence in it?
Well, first of all, they say that he is not a credible and trustworthy source because he's biased. So if we take a secular science paper, which was written by an evolutionary biologist, which is a naturalist, should we doubt that any naturalistic inference is not trustworthy because the author is a naturalist, because he is biased towards naturalism? If we are thinking in this way, then we should throw 99.9% of all the scientific literature into the basket bin. Because I mean, so many, especially in biological fields, the big majority of the scientists, they are naturalists, they are not God believers. So um, I think this is a very, very bad argument to say because he is a believer, his work is not trustworthy. But secondly, then what about the STURP team, which was most made of people which weren't Christians and believers? There were like, what do we do about Barry Schwartz, which was a Jew which didn't believe in the authenticity of the shroud for 17 years until he became a believer in 1995 based on new evidence that was presented to him? What should we do with others which were skeptics and atheists and then became believers? So I think this is a very poor and very bad argument to reject Giulio Fanti's work. Now, why didn't they take a more recent work like De Caro's work, which made headlines all over the world in many major journals, where he showed that the linen cloth is most likely from the first century? There is more recent work in regards of testing the cloth and its age. So I don't know. I've not seen the entire stream. I don't know if they investigated also De Caro's work, but
They did,
uh,
yeah. They,
I th yeah. So I think we have several new and recent scientific researches that point to the 2000 years age of the shroud.
I think yes, that's a good point. So one of the things I said, so in addition to the fact that they were ignorant on various things, and again, they admit that. So, we all got to start somewhere and stuff like that. As long as they're open to learning, I don't fault them because there's many things I'm ignorant on. But there was another thing, the issue of double standards, and you hinted to that because they basically dismiss all pro shroud guys as cranks. That's their word. But meanwhile, I mean, they're just accepting wholesale whatever Walter McCrone says or whatever the carbon 14 scientists like Harry Gov say without question, despite these guys are very outspoken, explicitly biased atheists who I mean, read their books. They come out saying, I want to disprove the shroud. This is BS. Religious belief is stupid. So that they're even more biased, I would say, than Giulio Fanti, or just as much. But there's
And
no
Carlos
skepticism.
Kelly, which is a declared skeptic,
He was
and his
funded. He
yes,
was funded by
exactly. His
atheists,
test
right?
was funded by an agnostic atheist organization from Italy. So why didn't they dismiss his work since he is also biased?
Exactly. So there's that's the double standard. So just try to give you like substance. I'm not just making claims that there is that double standard. And I find that repeatedly with a lot of shroud skeptics online and stuff like that. But in terms of the substance of what they said, just a couple points. So they do go into Liberato De Caro. They play Cameron's AI clip, and they're kind of mocking that a bit and stuff like that. That I will admit that was a weird format where he had an AI interview with Liberato. But beyond that, the thing I want to raise is, look, a lot of their objections relate to the bias and the can we trust the interpretations or how they're calibrating their curves to come to their conclusions. And I was looking for a clip, but I couldn't find it. But I just want to share my screen for a second and show something from their paper. So you see this chart here. Hopefully that's showing up. This isn't interpretation. This is not based on a calibration curve. Dr. Liberato De Caro, who's an expert in X-ray diffraction software here, the wide angle X-ray scattering technique, and is published in papers like Nature and other secular science journals using this technology. This is the raw data itself that shows so the orange is the Turin shroud, and the green sample is a 65 AD sample, first century. Look at the remarkable correspondence and overlap. It's not an exact match, obviously, because the shroud's treatment has been different to this other textile, and they've been through different conditions, and they're different fabrics who have different histories. But this remarkable correspondence, and in some places it almost overlaps each other. This is the raw data. There's no interpretation here. There's no chance for bias to make to be an issue here. This is just the raw dates that is spit out when the raw data itself. So that's really what convinces me above all else that there's something to this study. Sure, there may be more work that's needed to work out some of the kinks and test things, but when I see the remarkable correspondence of the raw data itself, remember, if the shroud was medieval, the orange line should be between this red and black line. It should be way up here.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Right? That would be 1300s.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the amazing thing to me, is that the raw data backs this up. You can dismiss, Falk, and you can accept Falk and the shroud skeptics, and maybe their bias is interfering with or something like that. But the raw data itself is backing them up. Any thoughts on that, Otangelo?
Oh, I fully agree with you. I think if you put all the different science papers on the table which have made these investigations, then it is very clear that the shroud cannot be from the Middle Ages and that it is indeed 2000 years old. And we are talking here about its history, about the history record. We are talking about the scientific evidence which has been brought forward by the Stirp team. We are talking about the blood, which is of a tortured man. We are talking about the position of the nails, about the differentiation between venous and arterial blood. We are talking about all the torture which is one-to-one matching the reports in the Gospels. We are talking about the 3D information, the photonegative information, the method how this image was made, which is mysterious. There are so many different lines of evidence, and if you put them on the table, it brings us to a clear picture that this isn't something that an artist couldn't have made up. How would he have cheated in a way that today hundreds of different scientists could not falsify and show that this guy cheated? I mean, this is just unbelievable.
Absolutely. Yeah. And one last thing on the waxes, just to say, because I noticed all the shroud skeptics, look, there was a subsequent paper to this one that to the X-ray dating on the shroud. There's also this one, long-term temperature effects on the natural linen aging of the Turin shroud. So this is an updated paper that the skeptics never cite, where they are going above and beyond and trying to improve some of the assumptions they made in the earlier paper that they're citing, right? So they look at the 4 different potential histories of the shroud that have been proposed for the shroud's pre-medieval times and take those into account, and they fine-tune their calculations to be even more accurate than what was in their original paper. And I find the shroud skeptic, they don't even know this paper exists. Again, it's not like this paper solves everything. Again, there's always more work to do to improve it.
I think he has published 3 papers which are relevant to the shroud. One, if I'm not wrong, in 2018 or 19, something like that, and then 2 more recent ones.
Yeah, so in terms of the X-ray date, so there's a 2017 paper that doesn't have to do with dating the shroud, but they mentioned the wax thing that was the one that was recanted, right? So they make hay about that, but that was more about bloodstains. Then there was the 2019 paper, which wasn't about the shroud, but it was about the establishing the technique itself. And then there was 2 2022 papers. So you're right, three papers on the X-ray as a dating technique, and from my understanding, 2 on the shroud. Are you saying there was one posted after 2022,
No,
maybe? Or?
I think you are mentioning all there are 3 actually.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. So, but yeah, I just find it interesting that nobody takes into account that they're still advancing the research and there are subsequent papers that are just ignored by the skeptics, um,
Yeah.
addressing some of their problems. Okay. So the only other thing, so at the end, towards in the last half an hour of their video, um, Nathan's alone and he goes under the contrasting explanations. So I'll just share the screen so you can see. He's got a little document here called Contrasting Explanations. And basically, he assesses the medieval hypothesis, the reason for existence that's well explained under the medieval hypothesis, whereas why does the shroud exist is poorly explained if it belonged to Jesus, with shroud images and stuff. He has a
Well,
bunch of other.
let me quick stop you here. They
Sure.
say that the medieval um, forgery hypothesis is well explained. So, did they explain why this artist would have used, first of all, a very expensive cloth, then secondly, painting a very faint image which wouldn't have much artistic value, then using an art style which was completely unknown and unusual in medieval times and completely contrasting to the styles that were used back then, which we know the differences, would have used the nails in a place which is correctly correspondent anatomically, but which other artists back then didn't know, using first putting blood on the cloth and then actually came the image. And if it would be an artist, he would have painted first the image and then put the blood on the cloth. So there are an image that can only be seen when you are about 1.5 meters or 2 meters distant and away. A man that is naked, which would be completely unusual in Middle Ages and being regarded as unrespectful. I mean, sorry, that used a cap as the crown of thorns and not a ring, which was usually used as artistic style in the Middle Ages. I mean, I could go on and on. So I am sorry, but saying that the medieval forgery hypothesis is well explained, that's just nonsense.
Yeah, I think Jack Markwart, when he was on my show, we did a thing, a show between him and Hugh Ferry, the Shroud Skeptic, because they don't mention Hugh Ferry by name, but they appeal to Hugh's Quem Queritas hypothesis, whereby they say in the show that, oh, well, there was many burial shrouds as part of church rituals, and they all had images on it. Well, actually, no. Even Hugh Ferry admits that there were no images mentioned in any of these ceremonies that were going on, Easter ceremonies that were going on in the churches. They just mention a burial cloth, a plain burial cloth, right? That was put out for the Eucharist and stuff like that. But there's no mention of an imaged cloth anywhere. So that was one thing a fact that the skeptics just got totally wrong, claiming that, yeah, there were shroud images everywhere for Easter ceremonies. That's just not true. It's funny because Hugh Ferry, basically, in terms of well explained, Jack Markwart goes over the theory and says that this isn't explained at all. Who made this? Why was it made? When exactly was it made? They don't have a date. They suggest, the two skeptics in this show suggest, well, it fits perfectly with the iconography or something of the Black Death period. So 1349 to 1350s, right? 1353, I think, is when it ended. And they say, well, that fits perfectly for when the shroud was made. But what they don't know is that the carbon-14 dating, the empirical data rules that out. The shroud can't date, at least the cloth, couldn't date from 1320 up to 1355. Those dates are precluded by the carbon-14 dating. So when you get into the details, it's very poorly explained. It's just kind of, what's the famous quote that a carbon-14 guy said in 1988? Oh, well, they just faked it up and flogged it, and that's it. End of story. That explains it. No, I don't think that works. Okay, well, here's something I do want to ask you about, because I had a person who's asking
Maybe
me
just
right now.
Yeah,
Sure.
maybe just to add quick,
Sure.
also that the blood under ultraviolet light he shows hollows, and how
Yeah.
would how would a forger have thought about these details, which came up, which we discovered much later?
Yeah. Yeah. So he's talking about the invisible serum retraction halos that are invisible to the naked eye, but they only pop up on the bloodstains through ultraviolet fluorescence. Um, yeah, an artist could not have purposefully done that and stuff like that, right? There's no way they could paint invisible or even know about serum retraction rings. Um,
Exactly.
well, I've got a skeptic. He's a Christian, believe it or not, but based on this episode, his name's WIPO. That's his YouTube name, but he's talking about the biblical accounts being totally inconsistent with the shroud. And I see these guys have that here too, right? Because look, it talks about linen strips and cloths. These are banded. Jesus would have been wrapped like an Egyptian mummy. They wouldn't have put one long linen cloth or sheet around Jesus. That's totally inconsistent. Secondly, the spices. How would you put the spices there? Because the spices, according to John, were basically at the cross. Jesus was wrapped up in these linen strips, and the spices were there with those strips. So that makes no sense. He would have already been anointed with these spices. So the women wouldn't have been coming back to do that and stuff. So I just want to ask you, like, how does the biblical accounts measure with the evidence from the Shroud of Turin? Isn't there a contradiction here in terms of the gospel descriptions of the shroud?
Yeah, this is an objection which comes often up to discussion, because in John it says that they use strips, and in the three other Gospels they say it was a sindon, the linen cloth. And in reality, we are talking here about actually three different types of cloths. We are talking about the head cloth, which was put on Jesus' head when he died on the cross to collect the blood, which was a custom, Jewish custom, in order to not lose the blood, which was said to contain the soul of the deceased person. So they buried the head cloth, this collection of blood, together with the main cloth, with the deceived person. So this is the head cloth, which was found by, we read that in when the Apostle John enters into the tomb, he sees the folded cloth there. That is one. Then we have the sindon, which is the main cloth, which is mentioned in the Synoptic Gospels, and then the strips. These are linen strips which were used to just put, because Jesus was in rigor mortis, and so they had to put the arms in position to bind them. Eventually, the mouth was open, so probably they did bind also the head and also the feet. We don't have these strips anymore, but that explains it. There were different kind of cloths used during the burial.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's obviously the scholarship of Larry Stolley, who's just written an academic book on this, but also all the mainstream biblical commentaries. So I was reading Craig Keener, and he affirms, look, nobody wrapped up their things like Egyptian mummies. In the Second Temple period, Jews would use one cloth or burial sheet,
Right.
and then they would bind it with strips or bandages. So that
Yeah.
there are two different Greek words there used. Um, but one thing I've heard, and I don't know the Greek, so I don't know if you know the Greek, but one guy was arguing, but in one of the Gospel Mark, chapter 15, verse 46, or something like that, it doesn't use the definite article. So it's false to translate it as a linen cloth. Instead, he bought linen cloth, talking about the bandages made out of linen cloth. Are you familiar with that? I don't want to put you on the spot, but are you familiar with that? Because I don't know the Greek, so I have no idea if what he's saying is true or not. But
I don't have this detail, so I cannot comment on that.
fair enough then. But from what I understand, everybody, Craig Keener, Ben Witherington, all the top scholars in the world, and a lot of the Bible translations do put that definite article, a linen cloth. And the thing that convinces me is archaeologically, as background evidence, the proof shows it. We have um, copies of the of burial shrouds, and it is consistent with the Shroud of Turin. It's one linen sheet, and then there was binding strips and that sort of thing. So the evidence just flatly contradicts what this guy is reading into the Bible, I would say. Um, but what about with the spices? Because he also mentions the spices, and I just want to make sure so he says that there's a difference between anointing Jesus and applying burial spices. So he argues that Nicodemus applied the burial spices, the myrrh and the aloes, to Jesus with the cloth at the cross. And what the women were doing, they were coming to anoint Jesus, which only applies to the head or the hair. Have you ever
Okay.
encountered that?
Okay, let me just I did find here. In Mark 14:51, it says a sindon, a larger linen cloth as used for a garment, a burial shroud, a sheet, a curtain, and then we have the sudarion, a sweet cloth, various kinds of linen cloth, towel, handkerchief, and then we have the otonion, diminutive, a sheet, strips of cloth, especially linen. So these are the terms used: sindon, sudarion, and otonion. Okay, and in Matthew 27:59, it says Joseph took the body wrapped in a linen cloth. And then Mark 15:45 and 46, Pilate gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrap up it in the linen, and placed it in the tomb. And Luke 23:53 says Joseph wrapped it in linen cloth and placed it in the tomb. And John 19:39 and 40 says Joseph was accompanied by Nicodemus. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them tied it, bind, wrap, by strips of linen in company with the spices. This is what this was in accordance with Jewish and burial customs. It goes
Awesome.
on, but I will not. I mean, you can maybe put the link afterwards in the description, so people can look up these terms.
Yep. I'll include send me those links and I'll include them on my blog page and YouTube description. So yeah, it is fully biblically consistent. In my research, when I went and researched these things, yeah, it is definitely a linen cloth. And okay, Bible archaeology. And in terms of the spices and that sort of thing, look, it's not true. I mean, John chapter 12, where the woman's anointing Jesus's feet, proves that, okay, it applies to the body. And it even says that originally she was anticipating this for Jesus's day of burial and stuff like that, right? When Jesus is saying, chillax, it wasn't a waste of money. It was for a good purpose because I'm not always with you. But yeah, I think what could have happened is there may have been multiple anointings, perhaps, and that sort of thing, right? So Nicodemus would have anointed it to prevent the body smelling as he transported the body to the tomb. But then they weren't able to do the full body preparation.
Right.
That's why the
Yes.
women had to come back with the
Yes,
spice.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That's what I think as well.
awesome. What do you think about the body being washed? Because that's another objection I've heard. I don't know what your take on. Was Jesus fully washed, partially washed, or not washed at all? Because obviously washing the body typically was Jewish practice, you would imagine, but the shroud is showing bloodstains that show he couldn't have been washed, at least not fully. How do we
Yeah,
reckon?
I think the body wasn't washed. We have to think that they were in hurry to solve this, because Sabbath was near, so they were really in hurry to solve this, to bury him.
Yep, yep. Okay, I think that covers, yeah, that covers everything. Um, yeah, that covers everything. Well, I guess with the spices, obviously, the reason he's mentioning that is because the Shroud of Turin has been scientifically proven to have no myrrh or alloys or biochemicals associated with life after, with funeral practices. So is that a contradiction, maybe? Like why is myrrh and alloys being mentioned in the Gospels, but it's not on the shroud?
Well, but in the Sudarim of Oviedo, there is actually traces of myrrh and aloe, and there is even some traces of wood.
Gotcha. So you think that the myrrh and alloys were applied as he transported the body when he would have had the sudarium over his head to catch the blood and he was being transported to the thing, but it wasn't in the main shroud once they got into the tomb and they were doing the proper burial. That's what you're saying?
I don't know if they maybe actually used some myrrh and aloe and it dissipated over time. I think this is a mystery. Maybe they brought the materials with the intention to making this, but then eventually with the hurry, they just left it there with the intention to do it later on.
Yeah, yeah, and that coincides somewhat with Ray Rogers and Barry Schwartz, who think that maybe they were in solid form in the tomb and placed beside the thing, so they weren't dousing the body because they ran out of time. That's why they had to come back on Sunday.
Right.
Um, but then, okay, I can see how that would reconcile. Then, yeah, the Murrin alloys on the Stellium, it was put on while they were transporting the body. Then they were going to put more spices and Murrin alloys potentially with the main shroud, but they didn't have time to do that. So
Yeah. Yeah.
gotcha. Okay, cool. Well, yeah, I think that covers everything that I can see. Again, I'm condensing 10 hours of material into like 2 hours. So I think I did a good
Yeah.
job of covering
Yeah,
everything.
I don't know if they addressed the pollens and the
No,
limestone particles that were found, you know.
they
I mean,
didn't.
there are other lines of evidence still. I mean, even 9 hours, that's not much. There is so much that has to be dealt with. So, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. They mentioned it, but they said they just didn't have time to look into it at all.
yeah,
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, yeah, I think that covers it. So yeah, I appreciate Otangelo coming on and giving his kind of reaction and review to some of these common shroud skeptical claims. And as I said, next week probably these skeptics will be coming on and in a discussion with myself. And if they agree, maybe Otangelo can join me for that, and we can have kind of a discussion back and forth on their points and stuff like that. So Yeah, with that said, what do I have coming up? Okay, on something, no, Friday is you. So tomorrow I'm going to be on the show with the Vulture, or otherwise known as David Spears, and it's going to be on the topic of typology in the Bible. So, certain messianic typologies. For example, Psalm 22 is a typology. It's not a prophecy proper. Or when Matthew says that Jesus was the Messiah, and as the representative of Israel, he went to Egypt and came out of Egypt, just like Israel did during the Exodus. That's a typology. So we're going to be looking at biblical typologies, and that'll be posted up tomorrow. Next week, as I said, I've got several Shroud shows. So if you're interested in the Shroud, I've got the one with the two skeptics, but I'm also been invited onto Dr. Tony Costa's podcast to give kind of an introductory presentation to the Shroud of Turin and answer his questions to the Shroud, because he's starting to get interested in that. Also on Tuesday at 7 o'clock next week on the Oakwood Wesleyan .org website, Oakwood Wesleyan Church in Toronto, I'm going to be teaching my Bible study, and that's open for everyone on Zoom. So if you want to come and attend, that'll be on the historical evidence for the resurrection. I think I've covered everything. There may be one other show I'm missing, but that's everything for now. So have a great week, everybody, and take care.